the woman behind the machines. The roar of aircraft engines filled the air, punctuated by sudden bursts of gunfire. It was 1940, and the Battle of Britain raged over the skies. Young pilots, barely out of training, wrestled with their controls as their Spitfires sputtered and choked in steep dives. Below, engineers and mechanics scrambled for answers, searching desperately for a way to keep the engines from cutting out in the heat of combat. Among them stood a woman unlike any other, a woman who had spent her life defying expectations. Beatrice Shelling had never been one to follow the script society had written for her. From the moment she first picked up a wrench as a child, she had been drawn to machines, fascinated by the way gears turned and engines roared to life. While other girls were given dolls, Beatrice had begged for tools. And unlike most, she had refused to accept that engineering was a man's world. Her journey had not been easy. The 1920s and 30s were unkind to women with ambition, and her dream of becoming an engineer had been met with skepticism at every turn. At the University of Manchester, she had been one of the few women in her class, enduring whispers and condescending smiles as she buried herself in calculations and blueprints. But talent could not be denied. By the time she graduated, she had already made a name for herself as a brilliant mind in mechanical engineering. Yet, even with her skills, the doors to opportunity had been barely ajar. Few institutions were willing to hire a woman for serious engineering work. But Beatrice was not one to wait for permission. She earned a place at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, where she worked tirelessly to improve aircraft performance. Her colleagues, all men, were slow to accept her, but they could not ignore the results she produced. Now, as war consumed Europe and Britain's survival depended on the strength of its air force, a crisis loomed. The powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered Britain's finest fighter planes were failing at the worst possible moments. In steep dives, vital for dogfighting, fuel surged uncontrollably through the carburetors, drowning the engines and leaving pilots helpless in the face of German fire. Every failed dive meant another plane lost, another young pilot who would never return home. Beatrice listened to the reports with a keen, analytical mind. She heard the frustration in the voices of the pilots, the desperation of the engineers who had not yet found a solution. She studied the schematics of the Merlin engine, tracing its weaknesses with a sharp eye. The problem was clear. The question was whether she could solve it in time. As she turned to her workbench, a new determination filled her. She had spent her entire life proving people wrong. This time, the stakes were higher than ever. And she would not fail. The deadly flaw in British planes. The air war over Britain had become a brutal chess match, where every maneuver could mean the difference between survival and death. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf 109s, sleek and lethal, dominated the skies with a cruel efficiency. British pilots, outnumbered but resolute, relied on their Spitfires and Hurricanes to hold the line. Yet a fatal flaw lurked beneath the polished metal and roaring engines, a flaw that turned every dive into a gamble. Beatrice Shelling studied the reports with a furrowed brow. The problem was no longer theoretical. The numbers spoke of tragedy. Too many British fighters were being lost, not because of enemy fire, but because their own engines betrayed them. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, a marvel of engineering in level flight, became its own worst enemy in combat. In a steep dive, essential for gaining speed and evading attackers, gravity forced an overwhelming surge of fuel into the engine's carburetor. Unlike the German planes, which used a fuel injection system to regulate flow, British engines relied on a traditional float-type carburetor. The result? A sudden, catastrophic fuel overflow, causing the engine to choke and momentarily shut down. Those few seconds of vulnerability were all the enemy needed. Beatrice listened as pilots described the helplessness of those moments, the sickening sputter of the engine, the lurch of a powerless aircraft, the feeling of being a sitting target in the sky. Some recovered just in time. Others never had the chance. She stood in the workshop, surrounded by tools and half-dismantled engines. The other engineers had examined the issue before, proposing complex, time-consuming solutions, ones that would require months of production changes Britain simply didn't have. The war was happening now, and every lost second meant another lost pilot. Beatrice knew she needed a solution that was immediate, effective, and simple. Something that could be fitted onto every aircraft without overhauling the entire fleet. The answer had to be there, buried within the mechanics of the engine itself. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Hour after hour, she dismantled, examined, and tested. She traced fuel lines with her fingers, imagined the flow of petrol under pressure, studied every component of the carburetor with the precision of a surgeon. What if there was a way to control the flow without replacing the entire system? What if the excess fuel could be restricted, rather than allowed to surge uncontrolled? The idea formed quickly, elegant in its simplicity. A restrictor. A small, precisely measured metal disc with a tiny hole, inserted into the fuel line. It would limit the fuel flow, preventing the engine from choking itself in a dive. Beatrice straightened, heart pounding. If this worked, it wouldn't just be a fix, it would be a lifeline. Now, she had to prove it. The breakthrough moment. The workshop smelled of oil and metal, a place where theories met reality. Beatrice Shelling stood over the test engine, her invention, small, unassuming, held carefully in her hands. The restrictor disc, a thin metal plate with a precisely calculated hole, was nothing extraordinary to look at. But if it worked, it would mean the difference between life and death for countless pilots. She inserted it into the fuel line, tightened the fittings, and signaled to her assistant to start the engine. The Merlin roared to life, a familiar sound that had filled airfields across Britain. Beatrice's sharp eyes followed every gauge, her fingers itching to make adjustments. Now, the real test. She mimicked the conditions of a high-speed dive, forcing an excess flow of fuel into the system. If the carburetor flooded, the engine would stutter, just as it had in the skies above England. But this time, something different happened. The restrictor held firm, regulating the flow. The engine continued running smoothly, unaffected by the sudden shift in pressure. It worked. A rush of satisfaction swept through her, but there was no time for celebration. A successful test in the lab was one thing, convincing the Royal Air Force was another. The skepticism of the military. Days later, she found herself standing before a group of engineers and high-ranking officers at an RAF airfield. They had heard of her proposal, but their faces were lined with doubt. The idea of a simple metal plate solving a problem that had plagued the war effort seemed almost laughable. "Miss Shelling," one officer said, arms crossed, "you're telling me that this tiny device will stop our engines from cutting out?" Beatrice met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, and I can prove it." The assembled men followed her to a waiting Spitfire, its engine already prepared for demonstration. A seasoned pilot climbed into the cockpit, casting her a skeptical glance before strapping in. Within moments, the plane was roaring down the runway, lifting into the sky. Beatrice held her breath as the aircraft climbed high, then abruptly pitched forward into a steep dive. Seconds ticked by. If her calculations were wrong, the engine would fail, just as it had so many times before. But it didn't. The Spitfire leveled out smoothly, the engine running flawlessly. On the ground, murmurs spread among the gathered officers. Doubt shifted into reluctant admiration. The pilot landed, pulled off his helmet, and gave a firm nod. "It works," he said simply. Within weeks, Beatrice's restrictor was being fitted into Spitfires and Hurricanes across Britain. Pilots who had once feared diving now had confidence in their machines. The balance in the skies began to shift. Beatrice had done it. But history rarely remembers the ones who fix the broken things. A legacy in the skies. The war raged on, but something had changed. British pilots no longer feared their own aircraft. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, once hindered by an invisible flaw, now soared without hesitation. Beatrice Shelling's simple invention had done what months of complex engineering had failed to achieve. It had given the RAF the confidence to fight back on equal footing. Yet, as victories were won in the skies, Beatrice remained on the ground, buried in her work. There were always more problems to solve, more ways to improve the machines that kept Britain's defenders alive. She had never sought recognition, and none was given. To most, she was just another engineer in a world dominated by men. But among the pilots, her name became legend. They called it Miss Shelling's Orifice, a wry acknowledgement of the woman who had saved their lives with a simple metal plate. It was an inside joke among the airmen, whispered in mess halls and hangars, yet always spoken with respect. They knew what she had done, even if the world did not. Beyond the war. When the war ended, Beatrice did not fade into obscurity. She continued her work in engineering, refining jet engines and pushing the boundaries of aviation technology. She was not one for medals or ceremonies, though in later years, institutions would finally recognize her contributions. To her, The work had always been the reward. But there was something else, something deeper. In the decades that followed, women who had once been told they had no place in engineering began to carve their own paths. Some knew of Beatrice's story, others did not, but all of them walked through doors she had helped to open. The quiet determination that had driven her, the refusal to accept the limits placed upon her, had become a blueprint for those who followed. The final flight. Years later, long after her days at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Beatrice still found joy in machines. She could often be seen racing motorcycles, pushing them to their limits, just as she had once done with aircraft engines. Even in retirement, she remained true to herself, a woman who had never waited for permission to do what she loved. She passed away in 1990, leaving behind no grand monuments, no statues in her honor. But her legacy was written in the skies, in the roar of engines that no longer failed their pilots, in the countless lives saved by her unshakable determination. Not all heroes are remembered, but some, like Beatrice Shelling, changed the world anyway.